Hi, and welcome to the midterm review. So today I'm going to be going over the chapters that we have read so far and talking about some of the big ideas from the chapter and start to get you thinking about what you might want to know for the midterm, applying it to some questions, and hopefully some of these ideas will help with your research proposal as well. So the midterm is going to cover chapters 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, and 11. So there's not going to be questions from chapter 3 or chapter 9. So let's go into chapter 1. So chapter 1 was all about an introduction to educational research, and this ties into really why you're taking this class, to help become better consumers and better understand how educational research is conducted and how to understand and interpret the results and understand some of the design, and then even be able to apply that to your own research proposal. So educational research is all about how research claims and knowledge claims are conveyed through empirical research, through conducting studies of all different types, and thinking about some of the critical thinking that you need to consume research, thinking about the difference between science and pseudoscience, and thinking about your beliefs about where knowledge come from and how research plays into all of that. So the chapter talks about 5 different types of research that we have in education: basic, applied, action research, evaluation research, and orientational research. So I'm going to talk a little bit about basic and applied because the other types are almost subsets of applied research. But basic research is research that is focused on theoretical knowledge, using empirical methods to make knowledge claims about theoretical constructs such as motivation, personality, memory, some things like that, that are general theories about learning and how humans come to be in terms of education. So that is basic research. And then applied research is taking that basic research and applying it to a specific situation, like a school or a classroom or a curriculum. So for instance, basic research might focus on memory and processes of memory and focus on the brain and how that works. And then applied research might build on that theoretical knowledge that came from the basic research and apply it to classroom engagement and maybe how certain engagement strategies or pedagogies might impact memory. So think about the difference between basic and applied research, and can you think of an example of each? Now, chapter 2, we went into the different types of design, which is really important for this course, for you to understand the difference between quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods research. So one way to think about these when we're thinking about quantitative versus quantitative is a confirmatory design, whereas qualitative is an exploratory design. So quantitative, when we say it's confirmatory, I think of it as top down. Others might visualize it differently. Quantitative research is confirming the relationship between 2 or even more variables. So the presence of variables is very important for quantitative research, and we are testing hypotheses, using statistical analysis to test hypotheses to understand, is there actually a relationship between those variables or not? So any type of research where you're trying to understand the relationship between one thing and the other, that is going to be best understood through a quantitative method. If you're trying to confirm if there's a relationship, if you're trying to understand a relationship, correlation, causation, you would be using a confirmatory method or quantitative research. So the presence of variables and hypotheses. Now, qualitative research is exploratory or inductive, and that is focused on using descriptive and oftentimes non-numerical data to make meaning and deeply understand a phenomenon. So it might be focused on describing, understanding, perspectives, and it is exploratory because there are no variables that you're trying to hypothesize about. Instead, you're focusing on deep understanding of that descriptive data to explore a construct and then analyze to understand what is happening there. And the mixed research uses both, integrating elements from both to answer complex questions. Sometimes those questions are asked separately, and then sometimes together. There's elements of that research question that are both quantitative and qualitative in nature. So if you think about how you might apply these different designs, let's say that you were interested in the impact of classroom technology on student engagement. So if that's how it was phrased, impact of technology on student engagement, would that be best answered by a quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods design? And then within that topic of classroom technology, what might be a research purpose that was qualitative or mixed methods? And it might be a topic that some of you are proposing for your research proposal. Okay, so within that, when we think about quantitative research, testing hypotheses, Chapter 2 introduces us to the concept of correlation coefficients. Because quantitative research, since you want to understand the relationship between variables, correlational research is one type of quantitative design and one feature that you will see. And so this helps tell you, really, when it describes the relationship, there's two aspects of that relationship that we're looking at. We're looking at both the strength of the relationship and the direction. And so the correlation coefficient is a number. We use R to indicate the correlation coefficient that can describe both the strength and the direction. So the strength is by the value of the correlation, and then the direction is whether or not it is positive or negative. But you can have a very strong correlation that is also a negative correlation, or you could have a weak correlation that is a positive. So here you can see some of the ranges for a strong, moderate, or weak correlation. I'll show you here. So here you can see these are both strong correlations. You can see R is 1, R is -1. So the closer to 1 or -1, the stronger the correlation. As you can see, this is positive. As one variable increases, so does the other. This is negative. As one variable increases, the other decreases, but these are both strong. Now, these are strong, not quite a perfect correlation, but still strong. You can see that most of the data points are trending in this upward direction, 0.75. This is also a strong correlation, -0.75. These are weaker, both positive and negative, and then here you can see we have no correlation. Now, the direction, and you all came up with some great examples when we did this week. So for instance, more study time, oftentimes higher test scores, a negative correlation, more screen time, lower sleep quality, but still strong correlations. And just to show you here, positive versus negative correlations. So even though this is negative, it's still a strong correlation. So let's look at an example. So if a researcher found a correlation of -0.45 between social media use and academic performance, what would that correlation tell you? Would it be strong or weak? And also, when you're thinking about correlation coefficients, be sure that you don't conflate correlation with causation. So based on this correlation, would that also mean that social media causes lower academic performance? So that is one example for you to look at. Now, Chapter 4 went into literature reviews and research questions, which is something that you've also been thinking about as you apply it to your own research proposal. So the purpose of a literature review for educational research and all research is to help situate the research topic and proposal within the broader field and within the existing knowledge that other researchers have already come up with. So when doing a literature review, you can use a database such as ERIC to find those peer-reviewed articles. We talked about how to do that through the Georgia State Library, where you have access to all of those peer-reviewed journals, and how to search for keywords, finding synonyms for your topic, to find relevant articles that might help you understand what other researchers have done related to your topic and how that can inform your topic. Your questions should be clear, focused, and researchable, so they have to be able to be answered with empirical research. We talked about some examples in chapter 4 of questions that are not answerable through research, and so I'm making sure that your question is answerable. Now, in mixed methods, when you write your research question, sometimes mixed methods have two separate research questions, one that has the quantitative aspect, one that has the qualitative, and then others have one integrated research question that has both quantitative and qualitative aspects. So when you're looking at a research question or even formulating your own research question, how do you decide what design is best suited to it? Would that research question be better addressed with a quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods approach? So how do you decide? So chapter 5 is all about writing a research proposal. I know this chapter will come in handy throughout the semester as you do your outline and then, of course, your final proposal. So there are several different components of a research proposal. Of course, we have the template in iCollege that we'll be using, but per the text, these are some of the sections that they covered in the text. So your introduction entails your purpose statement, also your literature review. Then your methods section in the middle has your participants, your sampling methods, your data collection methods, and then finally, how you will analyze the data. And because the different designs are so different, the research proposal has different components for each of these different designs. So I want to talk about this a little bit. Hopefully this will help you even better understand the difference between quantitative, qualitative, and mixed research. So in the purpose statement in the introduction of your quantitative research proposal, you would be defining your variables, your research questions, and your hypothesis. What is the relationship between those variables? So you would be saying, for instance, well, we'll look at some examples, so I'll stop there. And then in a qualitative, you are talking about the phenomenon that you hope to understand and posing the open-ended questions that you will use to drive that. Mixed, of course, will have both those exploratory and confirmatory elements. In the literature review, you will talk about different studies that might inform it. Participants in sampling. So literature review is going to have a lot of similarities, especially for our purposes in this class. For participants in sampling in a quantitative method, you might use a random or maybe a non-random method to choose your participants, because in a quantitative study, you're likely more concerned with generalizability. And so therefore, thinking about your sampling method will have a lot of implications for the potential generalizability. In a qualitative study, you're focused on in-depth understanding of a particular phenomenon. So you might use purposeful sampling. You might have a set of criteria, or another method from chapter, I believe it's chapter 8 about sampling that you might use. And mixed, you might have elements of both for the different components. Now, data collection for quantitative, you might be using a survey, you might have standardized tests, or another method, experimental design, where you have a control group, experimental group. And in qualitative, you might have interviews, observations, focus groups. And of course, we talked about there are some overlap there. And then data analysis and a quantitative proposal, you would be proposing that you analyze those variables that you have turned into numbers in either with both descriptive and inferential statistics. And we will get to that in the second half of the course. Qualitative, you will be using coding or a thematic analysis technique to analyze the transcripts or artifacts that you contained. And then in mixed methods, you will be merging elements from both to help interpret your findings. So hopefully here you can see some of the main differences between the different types of research proposals. I also wanted to give you a few examples to help you see. So this could be an example of a quantitative proposal, the impact of online homework on high school algebra achievement. So as you can see in their purpose statement, they are starting to put forth those variables, an online homework system. Do students who use that system perform better on algebra than those who use traditional paper-based homework? So as you can see, they want to confirm, is there a relationship between online homework systems and algebra, and then they are going to compare that to traditional paper-based homework. Here is the research question: does the use of an online homework system significantly improve algebra test scores as compared to traditional homework? And then, of course, they did a hypothesis because it's a quantitative proposal. So here you can see the methodology and the sampling procedures that we talked about as well, and how they will use statistical analysis. Now, compared to a qualitative research proposal, the title could be Teacher Perceptions of Culturally Responsive Teaching in a STEM Classroom. And the purpose is to explore teachers' experiences and perceptions of implementing culturally responsive teaching in a middle school STEM classroom. So you can see their question is focused on how those teachers perceived and implemented the practices. And the design, they are using a qualitative sampling technique and also interviews. And then in mixed methods, the relationship between growth mindset and science achievement. In the purpose statement, you can see they have elements of both. The correlation between a growth mindset belief and science achievement, and then also teacher perspectives on how mindset influences learning. You can see this one, they have two separate research questions. You can do it like that or have an integrated one. And then in the methodology, they have the quantitative phase and the qualitative phase. So those are some examples of how those different proposals will look different. Now, chapter 6, all about research ethics. So when we covered chapter 6, this also corresponded with your city training, which really went into depth about how to have ethical practices and make sure that participants who are involved in research are treated ethically. So this chapter also talked about how researchers need to be professional and how they need to uphold professional standards when they are engaging in research, of course, with their writing, not plagiarizing, making their writing their own, all of those different components that you need to think about when you're doing your proposal. When it comes to protecting participants, some of the big ideas that we talked about had to do with informed consent, making sure that participants understand what they are participating in, that they can withdraw at any time, and that you have their consent. The IRB, the Institutional Review Board, is who reviews proposals before researchers are allowed to carry them out to make sure that the researcher is adhering to the ethical considerations. And we use this principle of risk-benefit analysis, that the benefits must outweigh any potential harms. Now, you'll also have the ideas of confidentiality and making sure that you keep participants' identity and private information confidential. So making sure not to collect personal identifiers, and when you are writing about participants, using a pseudonym and not having any identifiable information included. We also talked about the difference between private and anonymous. So by protecting their privacy, you can keep it confidential if the researcher knows their identity, but they keep it private. Anonymous is when the researcher doesn't know it at all. So be thinking about, or feel free to share about, some other principles and some of the big ideas when it comes to ensuring that participants are treated with the utmost of ethical care. So chapter 7 talked about measurement. And so particularly in quantitative research, we are wanting to define the variables. And so using standardized measurement and assessment, thinking about those measurements and assessments that we use to define variables is really important. So when it comes to those measures, we talked about some of the different scales: nomial scale, ordinal scale, and some of the different types of measures that are common in educational research. It might be a criterion-based assessment. It might be norm-related. It might be an achievement. It might be aptitude. So we talked about some of the different types of measures that you might be using. And then we talked about how to evaluate the quality, thinking about the reliability and the validity of those specific measures. So the reliability of a measure has to do with the consistency of that tool. or that assessment, that test? Is it dependable as a test or as an instrument? So things like test, retest, if it's different forms, equivalent forms, if there is a rubric, we have interscore. And then validity is the accuracy of the test or measurement to actually measure what it claims to measure. So thinking about the content validity and making sure that all the different components on a particular measure answer that. So think about the difference between reliability and validity, and is it possible for a test to be reliable and not valid, and what would that mean? And if anyone is thinking of using a particular measure or assessment, if they're proposing a quantitative assessment, go ahead and share that as well. Now, Chapter 8 talked about methods of data collection. Of course, we have tests, which builds on Chapter 7. It could be teacher created, it could be standardized, it could be something that you found in ERIC, like a personality or motivation measure that has already been researched for its reliability and validity. We also have questionnaires. Questionnaires can be both quantitative in the form of a survey, a closed-ended survey, or an open-ended questionnaire where it could be used for qualitative purposes. And this is great to for participants to do on their own and to get information about their perspectives, attitudes, thoughts. Interviews are similar to a questionnaire, but instead of participants doing it on their own, the interview is when the researcher has a conversation with the participant. Again, it could be quantitative, qualitative, or mixed based on the nature of the questions. Focus group is most commonly associated with qualitative research, and this is when a small group has a conversation to allow for interaction and kind of group insights about your topic. Observation is could be either as well quantitative or qualitative, depending on if it is closed or open. But this is oftentimes in a naturalistic setting. It could be in a lab as well. And the researcher might have a list of criteria that they're looking for, or make tallies or timed, or it might be totally open-ended in a qualitative sense, and totally immersed in what's happening to understand behavior in real time. Then we have constructed, secondary, and existing data. Of course, there are some differences between these different types. Constructed data is when participants are creating something as part of the research. Secondary data could be artifacts that exist, documents, lesson plans, things that exist, pre-existing things. And then we have existing data that could be archival research, or it could be data that's collected as part of a state record, or another agency is collecting that data. So lots of different types of data, but in general, they fall into these 6 main buckets. So think about what is a method that you could use in quantitative research and a method that you could use in qualitative research, and how do they differ? Now, sampling. So sampling in research is the method for how participants are chosen from a given population. So when you write a research proposal, you would describe the context of where you hope that your study takes place, including the population of interest, the characteristics of that population, describe it, and then you'll talk about your methods or your procedures for how participants will be chosen, sampling. So in Chapter 10, there are lots and lots of different methods for quantitative and qualitative. So I just have a few here, but there are, of course, more. So here are some quantitative methods. Some of these can also be used. The two that are non-random can also be used for qualitative, but these could be used for quantitative. So we have our random sampling procedures, such as simple random sampling, stratified sampling, where you will make subsets to make it more representative, or cluster sampling if perhaps it is either more representative or more feasible to do it that way. Purposive sampling is when you have your list of criteria, like Maybe this is a music teacher who specializes in violin, who teaches 8th grade. So you have these specific characteristics that you have that you can use to guide your sampling. And then snowball is when you find participants through your other participants, ask them who else they might know that meet the criteria for your sampling. Now, in qualitative methods, of course, these last two are common in qualitative research, but there are many other examples listed in the chapter as well. So maximum variation, if you want to have a wide variety, or the opposite, you could have a homogeneous group sample. Opportunistic, if there is the opportunity to find a case that could be really useful. This idea of theoretical saturation, continuing to sample and collect data and analyze data until the theory has emerged from the data, since qualitative is an exploratory technique, or mixed purposeful sampling where you combine elements of more than one. So thinking about random sampling, which is, of course, a quantitative technique, why is it important in quantitative research? And then why is purposeful sampling helpful in qualitative research? Okay, and lastly, chapter 11 about validity of research results. Not to be confused with chapter 7, validity of measurement, which is a component of this, but validity of research results. Of course, this is something to really consider, and especially as you become more critical consumers of research, thinking more critically about the validity of some of the claims that might be coming across. So here are some of the big ideas in the chapter. There's a lot of detail in here. I'll just talk about a little bit, but some of the main concerns, and as it's phrased, are threats to validity. In terms of quantitative research, our statistical conclusion validity, maybe the sample size is too low, and so there's low power. Construct validity, I'll talk a little bit about that. Internal validity and external validity. And then in qualitative research, we more so say credibility or trustworthiness. How dependable are the findings, and some methods for that. And then in mixed research, we have these different methods of legitimation, which are evidence of validity. So we're always talking about the validity evidence. So in quantitative research, we have threats to the internal validity, and the internal validity refers to the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. So it particularly poses a threat to any causal relationships between those variables. So some of those threats could be like history, something happening during data collection that changed the results, maturity, that especially with children education, the kids would have learned that amount anyway. Testing, by going through the pre-testing process, learning inadvertently happened, or perhaps an issue with the instrument that was used. So an example, you have a reading program that you're testing its effectiveness to boost reading scores. However, there was already a literacy, or there was also a literacy initiative that happened. So that would be history, something that happened that wasn't planned that affected the results. Then we have threats to external validity. We call this like generalizability, because these are issues with the study design, intentional or unintentional, that limit the ability of the findings to apply beyond the study sample. And the goal, particularly in quantitative research, is to understand the population and to use the sample to better understand the population. So if there is an issue there, that's of course very disappointing and limiting in terms of generalizability. So it could be population validity, and you all did a great job when we looked at the example of the study about mental health and walking in an urban area or walking in a rural area. We talked about that and how there might be some issues there. They might not hold across time or in different settings. or with a different intervention, it could be different. So here's an example. There could be a study on STEM engagement in a high school that's conducted in an urban district, but that might not apply to a rural district, perhaps due to different focuses when it comes to STEM. So that would be a population threat. Now, we also talked about extraneous versus confounding variables when it comes to threats to the validity of quantitative research. So again, variables are associated with quantitative research. So what is an extraneous variable? An extraneous variable is any variable that could affect the outcome of the study, but isn't your independent variable. So you know that in quantitative research, you want to understand the relationship between variables. How does the independent variable affect the dependent variable? But an extraneous variable is anything other than that that is affecting it. For instance, participant characteristics, something about the participants, environmental factor, or even researcher bias that was affecting it. And then confounding variable is when that extraneous variable actually does affect the independent variable, which makes it impossible to isolate what the exact effect is. So good researchers are always thinking about what are extraneous variables, or said another way, potentially confounding variables, and planning for those when they are proposing a study. So when you are trying to control for extraneous variables, some of the techniques you could use are random assignment to the groups, control group, experimental group. We'll get more into this, matching, statistical control, or standardized procedure. So we will get more into the different methods you can use to control for them, but you do need to know what an extraneous variable is and what a confounding variable is. So for instance, if a researcher is studying classroom lighting, the impact on classroom lighting and test performance, but the classes that have better lighting also have better furniture and better ventilation, you can see how there might be a threat to, that might be the better furniture and ventilation might be extraneous variables that could potentially impact the student test performance. And so how could they maybe control for that? Now, lastly, in qualitative research, again, like I mentioned, we more so talk about this in terms of trustworthiness, credibility, dependability. So some of the concerns there are misreporting of observations or quotes, misinterpreting participants, or developing unsupported theories, and then also issues such as researcher bias. So some of the threats when it comes to making sure that participants' perspectives are accurately reported are techniques called member checking, where the participants themselves check over the researchers' transcripts or findings, or then what we call triangulation, where the researcher uses multiple different types of data sources, maybe interviews with observations with documents, to make sure that they are accurately interpreting the data. In terms of researcher bias, of course, when the researcher's beliefs, positionality that we talked about impacts how they interpret the research, which, I shared that I think that this is going to happen. And so it's important that the researchers are always engaging in this. The solution or method to address this is what we call reflexivity. And this is when the researcher is reflecting on their positionality and how their positionality is impacting how they're interpreting the results. Then we also have this threat in qualitative research called reactivity, where participants are changing their behavior because they know that they are being observed. And so a method to address this would be prolonged engagement in the field to try to reduce the observer effects. And since the goal in qualitative research is not generalizability, and instead it uses a smaller sample size that is purposefully selected, understanding that it doesn't generalize in the way that quantitative research does, using theoretical generalization to apply the findings to similar theoretical contexts and making sure that the data is transparent so researchers can interpret them. So those are some of the big ideas. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your other ideas as we all study together.